Hey y'all, happy Sunday. Hope everything is going well for you and yours. This is the portion of the show where we let YouTube send out the notifications via social media, let folks know that the broadcast is getting ready to start. We'll sit here and we'll count down the next 2 minutes before I push that button and go live. If you happen to be watching this on replay, go ahead and scrub past this graphic until you see my smiling face. If you have any questions and you're joining us today in the live chat, feel free to go ahead and add those questions to the live chat now, and we'll get to them in due course during this live Q&A session. So, sit back, relax, grab a beverage, and we'll get going in about 30 seconds. Hey y'all, how's it going? Hope everybody's doing well. Happy Sunday. We made it through another weekend. Rumor has it there's some big kind of a game going on today. So thank you for taking a part out for this mess that we call a live stream. So yeah, it's kind of been wild here the last week around the old homestead, but more on that on another day. Yeah. So today we're getting back into the epoxy pour, which I still haven't poured yet. I'm still in preparation for doing that, and part of it was trying to explain the logic behind overlapping vectors and why it needs to be done. So there are some real good questions that have already come in on the just on the comments of the video, as well as from a few other places. So before I get to your specific questions here in the chat, I'd like to go ahead and address some of those. And an excellent question came in from Bob Frail, who I have seen out there in the chat. How you doing, Bob? Thank you for the question. He says that one aspect he's still struggling with is the amount of overlap you need to preclude that bare wood scenario that I addressed, where the peaks of the areas in between the valleys in between the various colors could possibly be exposed. It has to be a function of the V bit you're cutting with and the depth. Yes, it is. Exactly. Your graphic looks like a 30-degree V bit. Yes, it was. So if you choose a 1/8 inch cutting depth, then an offset of 0.0604, it gets what you pictured. Therefore, your 1/16 of an inch is a good choice. Let me pause right here for a second and apologize to everybody who is running metric. Normally, if I quote a dimension in imperial, I put up a graphic on the screen that gives you a metric equivalent so you can kind of relate to a 1/16 of an inch. I forgot to do that in this video. So I know a lot of the metric folks are sitting there going, now I got to convert again and everything else. 1/16 of an inch is approximately roughly 1.5 millimeters. So I hope that helps that out. Okay. But a 60-degree bit would require double that, or 0.1208 inch, assuming my trig calculations are correct. And that is an excellent point, Bob. And as I said in my reply, that's when you switch the bit and go with a steeper or more shallow angle to make up for that. The thing about overlapping the vectors to create clearance is you don't have to bring down that peak all that much. Now, it just so happened that in my illustrations that I did in Microsoft Paint, it just so happened that that illustration, moving it over that amount, overlapping by that amount, brought those peaks down to about half the depth of the inlay. That's not required. That's not required. And in fact, Rob Sandstrom posted a video yesterday that he went into more of the subtleties and more of the discussion about cutting depth with, he used, I believe, he used a 30 degree and a 15 degree V-bit in his demonstration, but he did actual cuts. He created a piece of material that had the right thickness to where you saw the V cuts coming in, and then he compared and contrasted and got further into cutting depths and how to remove that peak in between the two angles. So I'm going to defer to his video, which I've already linked down in the description of this video, because he does a much better job of explaining that point. So what I was planning on doing was exploring that further in the next video when I get into tool pathing and bit selection, then explain why you would select that bit. And actually how much you need to actually bring down that peak to avoid surfacing into it. So today was basically explaining the concept of why and a little bit of how. Next video is going to be even more intense on the how side. So your question is a good one, and it's a valid one. And so for the quick answer right now, I would defer to Rob Sandstrom's video on the vector overlapping fundamentals. And as I said, I've already put a link to it down in the description box of this video. So do check that out. And if you're not subscribed to Rob, if you're not subscribed to Rob and you're interested in epoxy inlays, you're really doing yourself a disservice, because he's going farther in depth than I am. I'm still getting there, is what I'm saying. Let's see. There was another one here from Joe M. He says, I think I remember in one of the sessions with Shane and Rob, it was said that you could pour the entire outline in one color, then cut the other colors in. That way you don't have to overlap, since you won't expose the wood on the final surfacing. I know that wastes epoxy. Is this correct? He's partially correct, Joe, in that you still have to overlap where those colors meet. Because if you, let me pull up a screen share here on our Pirate. I always do that. I pull up the Pirate and then I try to reach over and screen share it. So let me screen share first, and then I'll pull up the Pirate. For instance, in this area here, I'm cutting peach. And here I'm cutting black. If I didn't overlap this vector, I would risk exposing the peach instead of exposing the wood. So you still have to overlap even in areas where you're pouring epoxy. I didn't make that distinction really clear, and I don't know if you can even see this vector here of the shadow. But where the shadow goes up into the eye, if I just left that shadow to meet that black outline of his eye, I could still sand down far enough to where I would have a peach colored gap between the shadow and the black of the outline of the eye. So even if you're pouring a base color and you're carving into that base color, you still need to reduce that peak. In this case, it would be the base color and not the wood that would show through. So I hope that answers that question. I know it's a pain, and the overlapping, Shane told me straight up that this pirate image is an epoxy inlay maker's dream because it is so simple and because those simple offsets would work. Not every pattern is going to be that easy. And he said, in fact, most of his projects, it's not that easy. He has to go in and sometimes node by node move things around because other methods just don't work. But then again, that's why they charge so much for these projects. This is not a $50 or $100 project. Shane has said several times, and Rob has agreed several times in the Q&As that I've been fortunate to get them both on, that you're talking about a project that can run anywhere from $400 to $2,000. And that's why there's a lot of labor involved in this. And this is not something you're going to have, today's Sunday. This is not something you're going to have Wednesday to present. That's not going to happen. So, and it has to be priced accordingly. So let's see. The other part of his question was, I know that wastes epoxy. Is this correct? And the answer is yes, it does waste epoxy. Let me go back over here to the pirate and show what I'm talking about here. If I come in and I pour this whole face and chin area peach, I'm then going to come along with his beard area here, and I'm going to carve a lot of that away. It seems like it's a waste of epoxy to do that. And this comes down to a judgment call on your part, in that yes, I probably could just carve this area here peach and then leave this, whatever substrate I'm using, a piece of wood, and then come along and carve this later on. But then I run the risk of, again, exposing that substrate here along this line. And if there are any little areas where I made a mistake or the radius of a bit doesn't get taken into account, because I don't have that black outline here to cover it up, see, I lost my train of thought on that. I thought I lost where I was going. Oh, yes. Okay. The amount of epoxy that I remove here, if there is a mistake, if there's a gap that I didn't account for, I have that peach color. I don't have any wood. If I don't account for the radius of a bit here on this inside corner, that peach color will show through. Or down here, actually, that peach color will show through and not wood. So it's basically to ensure you do get a good dividing line that looks realistic. I mean, beards are not perfect. You and I both know that. So if there's a little spot over here somewhere, or right in this area where the peach kind of comes down into the beard area, that looks kind of natural. You can associate that. You can relate to that. So it does waste epoxy, but in the great grand scheme of things, the amount of epoxy you're pouring in this area here and this area in here, the peach color I'm talking about, the amount of epoxy you're pouring is not very much. We're talking in fractions of an ounce here, or in fractions of a liter. I don't know how many milliliters the volume would be, but not very much at all. So yes, it does waste epoxy, but then again, that's part of your operating overhead. And that's why this is an expensive process. It's not for the faint-hearted. I'm here to tell you what. So it's basically there to keep that wood from being exposed. Now, another thing to consider is that's why Shane has become such an advocate and such a fan of pouring that entire thing in clear, because as a base color, just cutting the entire pocket out and pouring clear, because that clear will pick up and transmit the next color you pour into it. So that if there is a mistake, if something doesn't quite fit right, you have that illusion of that black outline, for example, being transmitted through that clear. And you can't see that it's clear until you get right up on it and take a look. And most folks are not going to get that close to where you can see a line as thin as the tip of a pencil lead. So it's, it kind of sounds cheesy to say it, but I heard many, many years ago and was taught many, many years ago that the difference between a carpenter and a craftsman is a craftsman knows how to hide his mistakes. So that's kind of what this is. If there is an error in there, you're making up for it and not scrapping something you've already worked on for 5 days and spent a lot of money getting up to that point. So now that still may happen, but not because of an opportunity to overlap now that you didn't take. So let's see here. I think that was the last one. Yes, that was the last question that was from outside of the chat. And I hope I answered them both there, Bob and Joe. So let's see. Let's go back up to the top here, and because there were some great questions up above. Okay, Brooks Martin asked, he says, how come you don't use a tapered ball nose bit? The Amana Tool 1/16 of an inch tapered ball nose claims a 5.4 degree angle. That is legit, and that is something that I asked Rob and Shane about, and Rob says they haven't explored it yet, but there's no reason why it shouldn't work. Especially if you have something with a small enough tip diameter. I mean, I have one tapered ball nose bit that has like a 5 degree angle on it, and it's got like a 1/4 millimeter tip diameter. Well, that should work perfectly. And that'll really help provide more depth down in those real narrow recesses that you're trying to get into. They just haven't done it yet. But when I presented that to them, they said, well, sure, there's no reason why it wouldn't work. The only thing you have to concern yourself is that tip diameter. It's got to be small enough. Because if you're trying to use a 1/8 inch tip diameter, that may be too much, and you may have that curve instead of that angle become a little bit more evident. The thing about using a V-bit versus using a tapered ball nose is that tip diameter, because a V-bit, that angle is straight the whole way down, where a V-bit, you have an angle that turns into a radius, and you don't want to expose that radius, because then your line starts moving outwards, if that makes any sense, when you get into sanding and what have you. But yes, there's no reason why you couldn't do that. But, and this could be a source of confusion, you have to remember the difference in included angle and total angle. Because, for instance, on that tapered ball nose bit with a 5.4 degree angle, they're only talking about the angle on one side. So that one side is 5.4 degrees. The total included angle is 10.8 degrees. That's how V-bits are measured. That 15-degree V-bit is 15 degrees with both angles included. So you're actually getting 7.5 degree on one side. Okay. So now Russell Faraday brings up an excellent point, and that's something that can be cheated. The tapered ball nose can't do sharp corners. The toolpath itself will treat it as such, treat it the way as if it could. But again, if you have a tiny enough tip diameter, it can look almost like a sharp square corner. So if you have an organic shape like that beard that I was just demonstrating, that radius from that tapered ball nose might not be a factor, because sharp corners, and when it comes to facial features, sharp corners don't really look all that natural. So maybe that little bit of a radius on an inside corner might be desirable, but it's an excellent point, that a tapered ball nose won't do as sharp of a corner as a V-bit will. But also, do your due diligence I can't talk today. Do your due diligence when you're researching a V-bit, because some of these bits don't come down to a sharp point. They have like a 1 millimeter tip diameter. So you're not really going to get a sharp corner with that either. So if it's got if the angle comes down and then there's a flat spot on the bottom, you're not going to get a sharp corner with that either. So do your due diligence before you pull the trigger and buy a bit. And I'm going to get further into that next week, because not all 15-degree bits and 30-degree V-bits are created equal. So let's see. I got to go back up here to get to the other questions. But yeah, my next video, I'm going to be focusing a lot more on bit selections and cutting depths when we get into tool pathing, because those are related. In this video, I basically focused on the why and the how to overlap. And I didn't want to muddy up confuse everybody. And come on, it was a 45-minute video as it was. I didn't want to keep going. I talk a lot about closed captioning my videos. That's why I speak so slowly. There were 45 pages of closed captions that I had to edit in my word processor to do this video. That's why I'm trying to cut down on the length of the videos. So let's see here. I'm trying to find the next question here. We're a lot talking about the weather and what have you. Okay, Garen 234, Gary N234, or is that Garen? Please let me know. I really, really don't want to butcher people's names. Would using an end mill instead of a V-bit eliminate the issue of exposing underlying substrate? In certain patterns, yes, you can do that. But again, an end mill won't make sharp corners. If you are doing something like, oh my gosh, let's say my logo, for example, and you can see it up in the top left of, or the top right of your screen. I could do the sunglasses with a end mill. I wouldn't need to use a V-bit at all, because I don't have any tight inside or outside corners. I could do a lot of the red circle with an end mill, but I still have those areas where the mustache kind of comes down into the red circle, and up at top where there's a couple of inside corners where the sunglasses come in. That would need a V-bit. And the mustache would need a V-bit, obviously, because there are some tight inside corners there. But in some things, you definitely could use an end mill. But the benefit of using the V-carve toolpath with a V-bit is sharp corners. And depending upon the pattern you're trying to create, depending upon the final product you're looking for, sharp corners will make or break a project. So yes, you could use an end mill, but you also have to remember that a lot of times uh, you are pouring one color, like the flesh tone in the pirate, and you're filling that entire pocket. Then you're coming back and you're cutting into that flesh tone to add the blonde for his mustache, or add the blue for his eyeball, for the iris of his eye, or not the iris, good grief. Well, blue for his eye, or the little pink color over in the corner there. So you're not going to expose wood, but you could expose that base color. So using an end mill as a clearance tool within your V-carve, yes, by all means. But you're still going to have to use that V-bit to get those sharp corners. So it just, again, it depends on the design, and it depends on how how intricate it needs to be, how close you're going to be when you're seeing it. If this is going to go up on a wall way up and you're only ever going to get 6, 7, 8 feet away from it, you might not need to be that detailed. But if it's in the case of a cutting board, people are going to be right there, holding it or working with it right there. So you do have to be a little bit detailed. So let's see here. Let's see, trying to get down here to some more. Russell says, I'm getting quite good at converting imperial to metric. I'm getting a little bit better at converting imperial to metric as well, because I have to stop and think about that. And again, I apologize today. I just totally forgot until I was finished closed captioning, and I went back and reviewed everything, and I went, oh no, I forgot to convert those measurements. Okay. Jay Hoyman, am I correct? When talking about pouring clear first, is it just a thin layer of clear, or is the clear a complete fill? Short answer is yes. I know you didn't want to hear that, but there are cases where they will just take like an acid brush or something like that and coat the inside to avoid the colors from soaking through. Like in the case of an end grain cutting board, as you well know, end grain soaks up liquids like you wouldn't believe, because those wood fibers that you're cutting off are basically straws. And using capillary action, Shane has said several times he's cut an end grain cutting board, poured a base color, come out the next morning, and the color has leaked through the bottom of the cutting board. So by brushing a thin coat of clear in there with an acid brush, you're sealing those pores so that your color pour doesn't soak through that end grain. And it's the same thing with bleeding outward. If you're cutting into face grain or edge grain, every time you cut into a piece of wood, you're creating end grain. And that's where folks who pour epoxy or use paint get in trouble, is they make that cut and then start painting that cut, and of course it bleeds out. So you have created end grain in that V-carve or in that pocket. You need to seal it. And that's why if you're painting, you clear coat it to seal that end grain. Then you can go back and paint fill or epoxy fill. So sometimes they will do just a thin layer painting with an acid brush, like I said. Other times they'll go ahead and pour the whole thing clear. It just, again, depends upon the project. So Let's see. Todd HC&C makes an excellent point. I think inlays are inherently wasteful to start with, done properly, whether you're talking wood or epoxy. And that's an excellent point, because if you're doing wood inlays, V inlays, you're taking 4/4 stock. And if it's something expensive like walnut, bloodwood, lacewood, pick your poison. You're taking that 4/4 piece of stock and you're machining most of it away to leave a 1/4 inch thick male inlay that's going to be inserted into whatever your background material is. So inlays are extremely wasteful. But if that's what you want to do, you have to incorporate that into your operating overhead. And that can easily turn something that looks like it should be $50 into something that costs $350. So, and that's something a lot of customers and clients don't understand is, there's a lot that goes into making these things. I can't give you a big box store price. That's the reason the big box stores don't sell them, because they can't give you a big box store price. So let's see here. I hope that answers that. Bob Hillhouse saying, I believe it's a full pour. Sometimes it is. And we're talking about pouring clear. There's a video out there somewhere of Shane doing a flag that way. Yes. He does it. Again, it depends on the project. And sometimes he'll have to cut into an area that he didn't think he was going to have to cut into that's already been poured. He'll have to come back and do a little bit of clear in that as well if he happens to break through into raw wood again. So, Todd HC&C says, doesn't Broing Wood use ball nose bits in his work? Yes, he does. And in fact, it was watching one of his wood inlay videos where he was using a ball nose that made me think of that, to ask Rob. So let's see. Let's see, trying to get in here. Big Daddy Fish 2. What was the type of epoxy best for this? There is no definitive answer. There are a few things to watch out for and a few things to stay away from. For instance, you do not need and you don't want to use a deep pour epoxy for this. Shane uses primarily West System epoxy, but he's not permanently wedded to that process, to that epoxy rather. He has used other brands. What you're looking for is something with a relatively slow or relatively open working time, a relatively high working time, but not so much that it requires 48 hours to cure before you can cut into it. You need something that will cure enough for you to be able to cut into the next day. A lot of the countertop or thin pour epoxies work well. But then again, they've had to at times come back with a quick set epoxy to make repairs or what have you. So there is not one right or wrong answer for that. I know that's pretty vague, but that's, what can I say? Let's see here. Lewis Denton wants to know, can you put more than one color at one time? Putting these colors on the same plane to reduce the number of times you have to take the project to the router table. Yes, you can. And it just depends on their proximity to one another. And I'm going to get into that when we get into tool pathing, because let me go back to the Pirate here. And boom, boom. There is, I've got right here, for instance, this is the blonde of his mustache. Here, 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 and here. There is absolutely no reason why I can't carve this blonde part of the mustache and this yellow of the earring and the gray of the sword at the same time, for example. There's no reason why I can't do that. I just have to remember which color I'm pouring where, so that although I have here this many layers that I'll be cutting, which will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 different colors or layers. That doesn't mean, that doesn't mean I have to cut 13 different times and do 13 different pours. There's no reason why I can't do the white on the skull the same time I do the blonde, the same time I do the yellow, the same time I do the gray of the sword. So it just depends on their proximity with one another. If you have things that are real close together, like I would not pour the blue for his eye, or the green, whatever color I make it, I would not pour that at the same time I poured the pink portion of the eye or that shadow line under his eye. They're too close together. And the probability that one of them is going to overflow into the next one is pretty high. So these three would probably be done on different days after the epoxy has cured. But yes, you can combine cuts and you can combine pours. You just have to remember what you've done, when you've done it, where you've done it. So, and again, we'll get into that in next week's video. Let's see. Russell Faraday says, how do you guys quantify / measure the amount of color in an epoxy mix to get a repeatable, consistent shade or translucency? Oh boy, that can be almost, but not quite 100% impossible. It's basically by eye and trial and error. Now, Rob Sandstrom has done an excellent job of coming up with a spreadsheet that will help you figure out the volume of epoxy you need. But as far as colorants, be they mica powders or liquid tints or both, that's basically a science of its own in color matching. It's very difficult to do without expensive equipment. Like, you can go down to the big box store or the paint shop nowadays with an item. I mean, I can take, I don't have anything close to hand. I could take this roll of tape, painter's tape, down to the paint shop. They can put this under an analyzer and match the color of this tape. The average home hobbyist making epoxy inlays doesn't have that technology. So it's kind of done by eye, You can basically, Brooks brings up a good point here. You can basically count the drops or volume of the epoxy and the colorants and then write that down, but still that's just going to get you into the ballpark, and you're working in such small volumes on a lot of these. For instance, if you're talking about pouring his eye, and I make a mistake in that, I can go back and carve that all out and then re-pour it. And if the color isn't 100% identical to the original color, no harm, no foul. But if I've got a mistake in his face, there's a piece of trash blew into it or something like that, I might as well just recarve the whole thing, because I'm never going to be able to match that peach color absolutely perfectly. And that is an issue. And that's another reason why Shane and Rob both take the piece into the house and pour the epoxy there, is to reduce the amount of trash that could be floating around in the air that will settle into the epoxy before it cures. The other is for consistent temperature. So Let's see. Jeff Woodywan says, can you use enamel paint to color the epoxy instead of the opaque dyes? It depends on the epoxy. Some you can. I'm about 30 miles away from Stone Coat Countertops, and they're one of the big epoxy distributors here, not locally, but nationwide. I think worldwide. I think they do ship international, but I may be wrong on that. I visited them a couple years back with Carl Jacobson, and they told me straight up right there that I could use Rust-Oleum paint as a colorant, but that's their epoxy. I would not presume to say what is safe to use in West System or Ecopoxy. The best bet is to contact the epoxy manufacturer. There may be some reactions that are very undesirable with this kind of work if you kind of branch out on your own, and you don't discover that until it's too late. The last thing you want to do is you do not want to affect the curing rate or the cure itself and end up with something spongy that never really hardens. And that's a very real possibility. For a demonstration of that, go look at Peter Brown's video on he calls it a lava bowl. And in fact, I'll look for it and link it in the description of this video after we're done live here, where he used an epoxy resin and then used a colorant made for another type of epoxy resin. And they reacted, and it just aerated itself and turned into what looks like a sponge. It did cure, it did harden, but you don't want that air bubble filled thing as part of your epoxy inlay unless you're going for that kind of effect. So you can have undesirable reactions. So I would say contact the manufacturer of the epoxy you're using. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Okay. Let's see. Rick A is saying, would you V-cut the whole perimeter of the pirate or just do separate areas, then seal with clear? I haven't decided that yet. Part of me is saying I need to go ahead and cut the whole perimeter and then seal it with clear. But that's going to depend on the wood that I demonstrate this on. So I haven't decided on that yet. So I'm not really sure. You can do that, but then we're going to get into the order of operations, because the way I have this planned out, I'm definitely going to be cutting that black, all that black outline. That's definitely going to be the last pour, because that's going to cover, I would say, about 75% of the overlaps I have is that black outline. So let's see here. Excuse me. Okay. Let's see here. Scott Malach says, when pouring epoxy, if you put the second coat on after a certain amount of time, you have to sand it for it to adhere. Do you think this is the same? The main reason for sanding is to allow for adhesion, to give that piece some tooth for the next coat to bite into. The V-bit's going to handle that for you. If you get down on, if you can zoom into that level, and I mean, get out your magnifying glass and look, that is not a smooth edge that V-bit leaves. There is going to be enough tooth there for that next coat of epoxy to adhere to. There will be plenty. So, but excellent point and excellent question. I don't think Rob or Shane have ever had epoxy on epoxy fail like that. So, and again, when they like for instance, if they brush in clear into a pocket, like in an end grain cutting board, they will purposely overcut that pocket, the depth of that pocket, let's say 0.126 inches, and cut that and then put in the clear, then come back and pocket that out again with a depth of 0.12. So it's not cut, so it's cutting into that epoxy layer, but not going through it. So if that makes any sense. So you're removing that glossy finish that you're talking about, and you're allowing adhesion. So, let's see. Jeff Woody1 says, tried some one shot on scrap. So far, so good. Got to make more test pieces. Isn't one shot more expensive than the colorants? I know one shot is not cheap. So let's see. Oh, hey, and Rob Sandstrom has joined us. Good afternoon, Rob. Hope everything's doing well for you. Again, this is the man, Rob Sandstrom, over at Generation Customs and Creations. I have linked his video that he posted yesterday on overlapping the fundamentals, why, how, and when. And he went into a much deeper explanation as to the V-bits used, their cutting depths, what's desirable, what's not desirable. So excellent video. And again, there's a link in the description box below to that video. So let's see. And he says we have not had epoxy on epoxy fail. Okay. Let's see. Todd HCNC says, so Mark, I think the black color would be your last pour, the way the overlaps fall. Exactly. And the way the overlaps fall, foreshadowing, the way the overlaps fall is also going to decide in what order all of those layers get cut and carved. So let's see here. RB Woodwork says, would you use a 2-bit carve a larger pocket or just stick with the V-bit? I'll always use a clearance. I will always use a clearance bit. The V-bit is basically used to define that outline. Now, there are going to be some times where the pocket is areas of the pocket are so small that your clearance bit can't get in there, and the V-bit will have to go back and forth and machine that out. But remember, in the Vectric software, you can use multiple clearance tools. So if you've got a large area with a narrow area that comes up into a point or something, I always run my V-bit toolpath first to define that outline, just so I'm cutting into solid material and I'm not chipping away an edge, a thin ridge or something. So I run that V-bit first, then come back with the next smallest clearance bit to get up into those areas that the larger clearance bit can't get into, but are too big to spend, a half hour, 45 minutes carving with that V-bit. So yeah, I would use 2, possibly 3 bits just to speed up the operation. Yeah, that means more tool changes, but spending, a minute changing a tool versus spending 20 minutes while a V-bit goes back and forth to clean out an area that's too big for a 1/4-inch end mill. I mean, swings and roundabouts. It's your decision. So, okay. I hope that answered everybody's question. And did I miss anybody? If I did, please. Okay, here we go. Rodney Roberts says, have you done a photo V-carve into a clear coat? I have not. I don't know if Rob or Shane has, but that's a very interesting idea. That's a very interesting idea. A halftone would probably work because with a halftone, you are drilling a series of dots. But I don't know about a photo V-carve. That would be interesting to experiment with. What say you, Rob? That might be an interesting idea. Okay, let's see here. Jim Brown, how much ventilation do you need, and can you pour in a closed room? Okay, I'm not a total newbie to epoxy, but I'm going to say it depends on the epoxy you use. I have used Stone Coat countertop epoxy, and it's made to be poured, in closed rooms. It does have a smell, but the propane torch that I use, the exhaust from the propane torch has more of a smell than that epoxy does. It's, you basically have to pour in a closed room. Now you also have to take the proper precautions. I wear PPE like crazy. I mean, it's always handy, but of course it's buried now. Well, hearing protection, Yes, it's in a plastic bag. We have Black Widows. And you don't want Black Widow in your ear cup, believe me. You do have to take precautions, but you also have to remember that epoxy needs a consistent temperature for even curing. And so you're looking at a temperature of around 70 Fahrenheit. Let's see, 70 to 72 Fahrenheit. So let's see what that is in Celsius. That would be 21 to 22 degrees Celsius. You need to keep that, pretty consistent. And yeah, you can pour in a closed room. In fact, it's just about mandatory, but it's also check with the manufacturer, because all resins are a little bit different. You can get polyester resins that are fairly cheap, but they're probably not the choice for this, because not only are they a yellowish color or an amber color, but oh boy, do they stink. So let's see. There was something else up here. There was another question up here. I got to find it. Okay, not less a question and more of a statement. Rodney Roberts says, ensure your epoxy is UV unless you don't mind yellowing in time. Dirty secret is all epoxies yellow over time. All of them. The colorants will help disguise that fact. All epoxies yellow over time. Peter Brown, and I've referenced him twice, he did a retrospective of a lot of the epoxy pours he did using various different manufacturers, brands, types of epoxies. And I'll have to find that video and post a link to it in the description here. But he went back over the course of 5 or 6 years and dug out all of his old projects to illustrate that point. All epoxies yellow over time. The colorants and additives we add to that epoxy disguise that fact. So there isn't a perfect epoxy that won't yellow. UV additives in epoxy will help, but they're not the end all and be all. And you also have to remember that we're talking about indoor projects here for the most part. If you're going to do something that's going to go outdoors, your better bet would probably be to be used like sign foam or something like that and paint, So let's see. We're getting close to the top of the hour. Russell Faraday brings a good point. Polyester does not stick well long term to anything except itself. And that's an excellent point. And that's one of the reasons why it's not really appropriate for this. My point in that was not all resins are created equal. Do a little bit of research. Shane and Rob both use a couple of different brands. There are a few other people out there on the interwebs who do use other brands as well. Look at what they're doing and see how they're doing it, and check out the brands that they're using. I mean, they're using these brands for a reason, and that reason is overall in general, they work. So, let's see, we got 2 questions that are up right now. Those would be the last 2. I'm sorry. Danny Garcia, what do you think of the pumps for measuring epoxy? I'm going to defer to Rob for that. And he did post that, address that rather, in I believe the video on calculating volume on his channel. And I've put a link to his video on the overlapping fundamentals. When you're finished watching that video, subscribe to his channel and go back and look. The video on overlapping fundamentals is part 5 of his series on epoxy inlays. Go back and start in part 1, work your way forward, and all of that will be addressed. So, and more or less the same with your question, Ron. Do you pour all colors and then sand and pour each color individually? Yes and no. Sometimes you can pour 2 or 3 colors at the same time, but then you V-carve into them again, pour your next colors. You only surface and sand one time, because each time you surface and sand, you're removing more and more epoxy. And pretty soon you're going to get down to where you are exposing substrate or you have lost detail. So, and more on that in Rob's video that's already linked down in the description here. If you take off too much, you will start exposing substrate or moving details or eliminating details. They're just sanded away. So, yes and no. So, okay. And Rob did address that when they work, they're good. Make sure you're getting a full pump stroke worth. Yes, it kind of comes down to what you are doing. In that, did you pump all the way down each time, or did you kind of go halfway? That's how you get in inconsistent ratios. Rob addresses that in his video on calculating volume and getting the mixture correct. And that's why they use scales. That way, when you know you're putting in 100 grams of resin and X amount of hardener, that's repeatable. I mean, you have a number, you can quantify that. Half a pump is arbitrary, because how hard did you push down? Did you go beyond? Did you not get quite there? But 100 grams is 100 grams, and that's all there is to it. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and say, wrap this up. Let's see, there will be just kind of a slight programming note, in that I've had a couple comments about the 2-minute intro at the beginning of this. Again, if you're watching this on replay, of course, we're at the end of the show, you've already done it. Scrub past that intro. The reason for that intro is to allow YouTube to send out the notifications and allow you to receive that notification that we've gone live. And it's also there so that the live stream is set and settled in, and it's connected with YouTube, and it's actually broadcasting. And it's not just all of a sudden the little progress wheels start spinning and I'm already halfway through a sentence. So it's kind of a buffer to allow the broadcast to actually start, um, allow me to give a greeting, and allow me to let the notifications go out and let folks know that we are live. The programming note is we're currently using 2 minutes. That's not enough for YouTube. So not next week, but in the next couple of weeks, that's going to expand to a 5-minute uh, preview, video pre-roll. What I will do, however, is I will push the button to go live and start that pre-roll at 5 minutes till the top of the hour. So I will actually be going live still at noon, but you'll get the notification a few minutes early. So you don't have to show up early. You don't have to, it just when I start using that preview, it's going to expand to 5 minutes instead of 2. So if you're watching this on replay some future time, just scroll back that opening graphic. And when you see me, that's when the show actually starts. So, okay, I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to especially thank a couple of people. Number one being, where did he go? There you are. Rob Sandstrom at Generations Custom Creations for joining us here in the chat and for getting me involved in this in the first place. You and Shane are just absolute wizards with this stuff. You've forgotten more than I've learned. And what I love about it is that you are so willing to share everything you know with all of us. Thank you very, very much personally. The other person I would like to shout out, and I got to find him here. Oh my gosh, where did you go? That would be my sponsor, Mark Lindsay CNC. The man's name is Steve Nealon, and his business is Harneal Media. He's the sponsor of MarkLindsayCNC.com, my website. He's the man, the myth, the legend. He creates websites for makers and the maker community. He's a web developer and web host. He can do as much or as little as you want if you're thinking about a website, if you want to create a web store to sell your products, or to hook up with an on-demand printing service who can print merch for you, coffee cups, t-shirts, hats, etc. Steve is the guy. He's the man that can help you out with all of that stuff. He sponsors my website. He does an excellent job. I've been with him for, gosh, what is it now, Steve? 4 years now. He is also a moderator here on my channel and helps me kind of monitor the chat and everything. And to be honest, he's just an all-around good guy. So thank you, Steve. I appreciate everything you do, more than you will ever know. And I don't pimp you out enough. So if you're looking to get into, looking to start a website, web store, etc., Steve Nealon, he's your man. He is Harneal Media. If you talk to Harneal Media, you're talking to Steve. So thank you again, Steve, for everything you have done in the past, and I appreciate it. Oh, holy cow. Bob Hillhouse. I mean, what can you say here? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. I mean, you guys are just absolute, just the best, really. This, I know I kind of gush a little bit when somebody hits that super chat, but you'll never understand what that means to me, that somebody would throw some of their hard-earned money on some dude in a shed who makes long, boring videos. It just totally mystifies me, but I appreciate it. Thank you more than you'll ever know, Bob. Seriously, you guys are the best. Okay, let's end this. And again, if you have any kind of questions on any of this stuff, go ahead and put it in the comment section. down below. I read every comment. I'm not always able to respond to every comment because there's just not enough hours in the day to sit here and do that. But I do read every comment, and if I need to, I will, and I'm able to, I will address your question. Bob Hillhouse says, split it with Rob. Done. Rob, email me your PayPal info. Done. I will do absolutely that, Bob. So there you go, Rob, your first super chat. All righty. That is actually a very good question, Ayal. Is Peter Lindsay related to Mark Lindsay? I don't know of a Peter Lindsay in my family. And I see you spelled the name right. That's excellent. But you know what? Let me put it to you this way. And this is more than you want to know. My great grandfather had 13 brothers and sisters, and they were all farmers and had huge families all the way back, as far back as we can figure out. We may be related. I mean, who knows? And my family's been in this valley since 1866. So as I tell people, I'm so local, I'm related to myself, But anyway, he very well could be. Okay, let's end it here. This is more than you wanted to know. This is way beyond the scenes, and people are bailing on this live stream faster than the rats on the Titanic. So until next time, next week will be open Q&A. So go ahead and get any questions on any of the stuff that you wanted to talk about. Gathered up, and we'll do that next week. So until then, yay sports ball. I don't follow football. Have a great afternoon. Be safe. Don't indulge too much. And watch out for those buffalo chicken wings, man. Too many of them will put you to sleep. So see you next week. Have fun. And y'all take care. Thank you once again.